to Dustin's Kaleidoscope. I am Dustin, and I have the pleasure of being here today with Mike Sobel. He is a producer of Nostalgia Alley. He's been here for a while, and I thought it would be great to have you on the show. Thank you so much for
being on my favorite TV show. I've been listening to your show since I was so high. I mean, I love your show. Absolutely.
That's awesome. So I'm so glad you came, because I have worked behind the scenes on your show, and I just think all of the different things that you all the different people that you interview and some of the products that people bring are just so interesting. And
you get a lot of people on parole.
That too, right? That too. So, but I wanted to find out, like, how did you even get started in community television?
Do we have a couple of hours?
Just, yeah, about.
Okay. Way back in about 1975, something came out called cable television.
Okay.
Up until that point, people had rabbit ears and they tried to get stations. And there was a company called Manhattan Cable, and they decided to wire all of Manhattan so people could get perfect reception. But unable to get the franchise license, they had to supply public access TV.
Okay.
So anybody interested in TV could have a spot.
Okay.
And I said, wow, I'd love to do that. My dream is to have a show on nostalgia. And that's how it all started.
Really?
It all started back then. And
why nostalgia?
Well, I love nostalgia, and it started when I was a kid. I had tonsillitis. I had a lot of problems with my tonsils. So one day I was sick in bed, and I didn't know what to do, and my father came in with some old 78 records of all of the old-time music, Glenn Miller, Kay Kaiser, all the greats, and I put it on the turntable, and I listened to this music, and I said, this is a wonderful time. I love the old-time music, and that got me started in nostalgia. And when I decided to do the show, I had absolutely zero experience. How do I do it? Okay. Well, the number one nostalgia guy in New York, and this was live television back in the 70s, was Joe Franklin. And he had been on, at the time, something like 30 plus years. And I said, I'll go to Joe Franklin. I'll get advice on how to do a nostalgia show.
Did you know him?
And I didn't know him.
Oh, okay.
And I figured, well, I'll try to go there. There'll be a secretary, a super secretary. Maybe I'll get an appointment in 8 months, you know.
Right.
So I found out his address. I went in, opened up the door, and there was Joe Franklin by himself behind the desk. And I introduced myself. It was very nice. And he had an office that was like the Collier Brothers. I have never seen such clutter in my life. On his desk, he had 8 by 10 photographs, glossy, of every single movie star in the world. You could say, I want a Mae West photograph. Like a computer, he would leaf into the pile and pull out Mae West.
Really?
It was like a human computer. So I told him what I wanted to do, and he said, great. He said, you know, there's a guy, Richard Ruffin. He's a PR guy. Get to meet Richard. And I met Richard, and he introduced me to some people. He was a wild guy, never bought a meal in his life. He said to me, you know what, the Chilean ambassador is having a dinner. It's good. Do you like lobster? Love lobster. He said, come with me. We went over. We had this spread of lobster and buffet, and it was. He knew the right people.
Right.
And so I decided to do the show. No one knew what Nostalgia Alley was. No one knew me. And my very best friend's father was Rudolph Valentino's double in silent movies, Ted Delmonico. And what he did for a living was he sold magic tricks at Polk Hobby Shop in New York, right near the Empire State Building. I said, I'll ask him to come on. And he said yes. And then there was a woman called Evelyn Mike, and she was a drama teacher. And I asked Evelyn if she would come on. She said, fine, I'll come on. There was a guy called Jim Claddick, produced live shows for the public access cable, and I was the first live show in the history of cable. The first one to do it live, every Wednesday night at 10:30.
Oh, so it wasn't just this one particular show?
It was live, and then we taped it, and we would show it, but it was the old reel-to-reel Sony tapes, not what we have today, digital.
Okay.
It was a reel-to-reel machine, very archaic. And I did the first show, and Ted was there, and he did the magic tricks, and it was like da 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 da. And then I said, now it's time for the second half. And I didn't know what Evelyn was going to do. She did a poem with one of her associates, and she played the part of a man going to the death chamber. And I'm going, talk about a crazy segue. And that was my first show, and that led me on to doing some pretty interesting shows, some very interesting guests that were on.
Wow. And so that was back in 75.
That was 75.
And then when did you come to Soma Television?
1944. No. I came on probably about 15 years ago.
Okay.
And one of my memorable guests, who I absolutely love, was a guy called Irving Caesar. He was a lyricist. He worked with George Gershwin. He wrote Tea for Two. He wrote Swanee, Crazy Rhythm. This guy was a super celebrity in the music business. And through Joe Franklin, he agreed to do the show.
So you're pleased to have connections.
He came on, and I'm a kid, I'm like 30 years old, and I'm sitting next to history. This is the guy who wrote Swanee, Tea for Two, and you know, he's talking to me on television, you know.
So even at 30, you understood the significance.
I did. And he was a multi-millionaire many times over just from royalties of the songs that he wrote. And he came on, thank God it wasn't in color. We did black and white back then. He had blue pants, and he had a brown jacket with, he loved to smoke a cigar, cigarette burns all over the jacket. But this tour, he talked about these wonderfully Tea for Two, Swanee, George Gershwin. And I said, well, tell me about, how did you write Swanee? He said, oh, I wrote that in about 3.5 minutes. The guy, every week he'd do 10 or 12 songs.
Wow.
And he said, I'll tell you a story. He said, I was in an airplane, and we were flying over the Mississippi River, you know, Swanee. And the stewardess said, look down, that's the river you wrote a song about. And he looked at this river. It was a horrible, muddy, disgusting looking thing. He said, if I had seen the river before I wrote the song, I never would have written it. And he was one. You'd say, hi, Irving, it was a whole show. And then I did a show with my idol, Danny Stiles. He had a show in the 70s where he played all of the old music, all of the nostalgia. And before I went on a date, I'd turn on the radio in my 1957 Oldsmobile convertible, and I would listen to Danny. He'd be playing Gershwin, and he'd be playing, you know, all of the wonderful bands of the 30s and 40s. I had him on the show, which was a thrill because I was a regular listener. And I said, you know, how'd you get started? And he said, well, I actually bought airtime, and then I found sponsors. And I said, Danny, how long you been on the air? He said, I've been on a radio, around, give or take, 60-plus years.
Oh, my.
He was a legend in the business.
Wow.
And he was a wonderful guest. I said, Danny, how many, your personal collection, how many records in the basement? He said, I don't have that many. I only have about 250,000 record albums in the basement, because when he played a record, they would give him a free record to listen to, to promote. And he was a wonderful guy, you know, next to my childhood idol. And then there's a guy called Alan Siegel wrote a book about Olympic Park, which is a very big amusement park in Maplewood, Livingston. It was bigger than Palisades. No one knew about Olympic Park. Palisades, amusement park, Coney Island, nobody knew what Olympic Park was. They had a huge roller coaster. They had the world's largest saltwater pool. And they built it about the 1880s. It stopped about 1965. He was a guest, wonderful guest, and he talked about, it was in Maplewood, Livingston, not Livingston, Maplewood, Irvington.
Okay.
So they had gambling, so they would have a gambling machine in Maplewood, and then the authorities would say, you're not allowed to have that. So they moved it a few feet into Irvington, and they were able to do it. They move it back and forth, and they got away with the gambling laws. But he was a terrific guest. So I've been very fortunate. You know.
So it sounds like from the very beginning, you just were brave enough to walk into this person's office. But actually, you didn't even think you'd be able to be seen by him. You thought you'd run into a secretary.
I did.
So you must have been surprised. Or were you?
I mean, I was very surprised.
Really? But
he was a guy who anybody could walk in and talk to Joe Franklin. He was a real people person. And he had a philosophy, never say no.
Okay.
So anything you'd say, he'd say, yes, boss, and he would never say no. And people would call him and they'd say, Joe, I want to be on your show. I can juggle a grapefruit on my nose. And he would say, you call people boss. He'd say, boss, that's great. I love the act. Want you on the show. Call me on Thursday at exactly 1:15. So the poor person would call him at 1:15. He'd say, "Oh, I'm so happy you called. It's great you called. I can't talk to you now. Call me Thursday at 3 p.m. sharp." He'd call 3, and he'd wear the people out.
Oh.
And then they'd finally give up. But he never, ever said no to anybody.
Interesting.
He was a great personality. Unfortunately, he died a couple of years ago. But he was Mr. Show Business. He had Barbara Streisand when no one knew what Barbara Streisand, who she was. She was on the show. Bette Midler, big personality, she had to borrow cab fare to be on the show.
Oh, that's so funny.
I saw the show, and Bette Midler said to Joe Franklin, "One day I'm going to be a superstar." And everybody laughed in the studio. She was funny looking, you know. She had talent. Everybody kind of laughed. She said, "One day I'm going to be a superstar," and she ended up being a superstar, because if you're determined to do something, by gosh, you're going to do it.
Wow.
And he was Mr. Show Business.
Wow. It sounds like you have a book inside of you.
I think I do somewhere. Is it up my sleeve? Or
Well, do you think it was, so now, I mean, I know you regularly do shows here at Sony Television.
Absolutely.
So do you find it easy to get to find guests and?
Well, I don't think it's ever easy to find guests. You always have to be searching and searching and searching, and you may have a friend who has an interesting story to tell. So there are a lot of stories out there, but you know how it is. It's not easy to do. People are not knocking on your door.
Seems like it's easy for you.
People are not knocking on your door, so you really have to hustle and you read the papers and News Record and articles and. When I did the show back in '75, no one knew what cable was.
Right. So so that was one thing I was interested in, because you started when cable was just starting. And we're going to run out of time, so I'm going to have you answer part of it now, and then we'll catch the rest on the other side. But cable was just starting. So how did you even approach people to ask them to be on this type of television as opposed to like the big, 5 or 3 at that time?
Well, people didn't know the significance of cable, but yet there was a certain mystery. Cable, what is that? Maybe I should try cable. I do that. And I would call up, there would be a big article in the New York Times. This is a different era.
Right.
And I would call up the New York Times. I'd talk to the publisher, and I'd say, your friend is doing a story on the history of Chicago, a history of New York. I'd like to interview, and they would actually give out the name of the person and the phone number.
Wow.
And
that would never happen today.
That would never, ever happen today.
Well, you know what? We're just about out of time for this segment, but we'll be right back.
Can I come back for the second?
You certainly can. In fact, I insist that you come back. Okay. This is Dustin's Kaleidoscope. I am Dustin, here with Mike Sobel. We're going to come back and talk some more with him after the break. Hi, and welcome back to Dustin's Kaleidoscope. I am Dustin, and I am here with Mike Sobel. Thank you for coming back. I know you were thinking about, not coming back.
I'd always come back for you.
Oh, wonderful. So at the end of the segment, you were telling me a little bit about what it was like when you were first starting out, like the whole cable television revolution.
Well, there was a mystery about it, and people didn't know what it was. So when I said I have a cable show, it was like maybe Otto Preminger saying, I have a new star for you for the movies. So I was able to open a lot of doors through saying I was a producer of cable.
Oh, okay.
And everything then was done live. It was as we did it. And there was a guy called Jim Claddock, who was an executive at ABC, who got fired. And he had a lot of time on his hands. He decided to open up a little studio on 23rd and Park Avenue South. And it it was a walk-up, and it had the old black and white cameras, and there was Jim, and you had your guests come up, and it was very, very crude television, you know. But there was a certain excitement because everything was new.
Right.
And, you know, it was the excitement doing it, especially if you do it live, because there is an adrenaline high when you're doing a live show.
When you say it was live, do you mean live to tape, or do you mean it was live on
Live
air?
going through the...
You are kidding.
It's live, no tape,
and
live
no
going through.
5-second delay?
But the bad thing was, sometimes things happen on a live show. And I had a guy who was a cameraman, and he's, you know, I have a grandmother, and she should be on it. She's from Pennsylvania. And, you know, she was there during the Chicago fire. And I'm going, oh my, I said, she's a part of history. Would she come from Pennsylvania to New York? I'll get her to come, right? So I talk a little bit on the show, very verbal, and she's talking about, I think it was a fire in Chicago and how many people, Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over the thing. And so I get her on, and I'm like, damn, this is history. Right. And I said there, wow, it must have been unbelievable. You lived during the Chicago fire. It must have been unbelievable. She said, yes. That was it. I said,
man.
You know, were you scared? Was it? She said, yes, I was. Everything was either a yes or a no. Didn't elaborate on anything. Thank God I did my homework. And I kind of said, well, when the show I have back in the blah, 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 you know, and I was able to pull it off. But sweet woman, wonderful, but on camera, I don't know if it was a nervousness. It was, yep, nope, yep. It was like, you know, Gary Cooper was known for going, yep, nope. And that was, and through the entire interview, it was yep and nope.
And so did she change while she was on camera, or was she just like that, monosyllabic, like answers the...
Well, off camera, she was very verbal, but on camera, she I know, she froze or whatever. But, you know, people will react differently when, as you know, there'll be one way before and then one way when you have them in front of the camera. So,
wow. So that was probably quite an experience, considering it was all live television.
All live, so, you know.
And is this like a 30-minute segment, or is it 15 minutes? Oh boy, okay. So you really had to.
And then following my show is a show called Midnight Blue, and that was an X-rated show.
You had that show as well?
I didn't do that. No, don't get me in trouble with my wife here. But it was Midnight Blue, and there was a lot of nudity, and everybody was lined up to volunteer to be behind the cameras, you know. So it was hilariously funny. But I had a great.
It was out of the same studio.
It was the same studio.
Oh, okay.
And then all these women would come in after my show, you know.
But you never stayed, of course. Yeah. You left right after.
I left because I had other things I had to do. But I remember the Midnight Blue. Everybody wanted to volunteer for that show.
That is hilarious.
It's amazing, you know. But that was the early days of television.
And so this was just someone decided, just created a studio and just sort of opened it up?
He just opened it up, and he was the first person to do it. That was the first studio for cable TV in Manhattan.
Wow.
And there were a lot of interesting shows as a result of that. You know, I think Alex Bennett did Midnight Blue, and he became a big disc jockey radio personality. But it was like a Jekyll and Hyde. He was a nice kind of guy in the radio, and it was wow, whoopee time, you know.
Oh, okay.
So there were a lot of people, you know, who kind of did that type of thing. So it was interesting.
So you've been doing community television since 1975?
Well, off and on, yeah. I've been here 15 years.
So what keeps you, like, you don't ever run out of ideas, or
what keeps me going? Is that the question?
Yeah, that's the question.
Senility. But other than that, yeah, that keeps me going.
Because I would think that after all these years, you've covered quite a few. Like you never get bored. I mean, I've seen your show many times, and it's like you just started. Every time I see your show, I feel like, oh, you've just started, like, in the last year or two. Like the excitement, the enthusiasm.
My philosophy is I'm going to continue doing it until I get it right. That's what I'm going to do.
Well, it seems like you're already doing it.
Well, it's a lot of fun. You know, you meet a lot of interesting people. I mean, it's just amazing the amount of people, you know, you develop friendships with people. It's a wonderful, you know, and your show is terrific. And so many wonderful shows on
There are a lot of different
wonderful,
shows.
Wonderful shows.
And so you are just going to keep, I mean, obviously you're going to keep on doing it.
I'm going to keep on doing it.
And is there anything that, so I want to let people know, people who are just joining us, that you're Mike Sobel, and your show is Nostalgia Alley.
Nostalgia Alley.
Also on this TV station and on YouTube, on the Soma TV YouTube station. And you specialize in nostalgia.
Yeah, and in fact, Nostalgia Alley, the name for the show, was derived from Fred Allen did a radio show called Allen's Alley back in the 30s and 40s.
Wow.
And that stuck with me, Allen's Alley. I said, well, you know what, I'm going to do a show and call it Nostalgia Alley.
Okay.
Well, people thought we did it in an alley, but we didn't do it. We did it in the studio.
Oh, so is there anything that any shows coming up that people should look for?
Well, we're going to have a Broadway harpist. She's going to bring a harp, she's going to play some heavenly music. It's going to be a heavenly show.
Oh, it sounds like it.
We're covering not only this planet, but up there. So got to have a wide audience on that one. But yeah, you never know. I sort of ad-lib it a lot, and you know, I never know from one day to another what I'm going to be doing.
Okay. So as far as so that's coming up next. Like when you're planning out your shows, are you thinking like I need to have a musician, perhaps a harpist, or is it just really just whoever interests you or whatever subject?
Whoever interests me, you know.
Really?
And you know, growing up in the 50s, I had a great interest in TV because I was brought basically up in watching Howdy Doody.
Okay.
Which was one of the first kid shows.
Yes.
Howdy Doody, way before your time. Howdy Doody and Buffalo Bob Smith and Clarabelle the Clown, and I grew up watching Captain Video, which was a great kid show, an outer space show, with Al Hodge and Don Hastings as a ranger, and it had a. This is on the Dumas Network. The budget for the sets on that show were $200 a week. So they had cardboard.
A week.
Yeah, a week.
That's
amazing. And they had, all their sets were made of cardboard because they couldn't afford wood. Right. And they did it but it had a big following.
Right.
In fact, the Honeymooners has an episode about Captain Video. They get a TV and they fight over the TV, and Ed Norton wants to watch Captain Video, and so he's very much into the Captain Video thing. And then I used to watch Show of Shows with Sid Caesar, Carl Reiner, Imogene Coker. And that was amazing because that was a Broadway quality show, just shot in the 50s. It was a 90-minute show of live because everything then was live. They didn't have videotape to fall back on. And watching that was just magic. So I just got that nostalgia bug. Just couldn't get enough.
And do you think the different people that you've mentioned influence the way you interview, like who you want to? Obviously, you have a niche of having nostalgia, but did any of those people influence the way you interview?
Well, I think watching Joe Franklin interview, really influenced a lot of how I interview. Watching Jack Parr, watching Johnny Carson, my idol, all-time idol was Steve Allen, because he was just so good with the ad-libbing. And when I was a kid, I wore glasses, and I was very self-conscious. People would say, hey, four eyes. They'd make fun of you if you had glasses back then. And Steve Allen wore glasses, and no one made fun of him, and he had a TV show. And I went, wow, he has glasses, I have glasses. If he can do it, maybe I can do that. And he was a big influence on me in
That's
TV.
Great.
Yeah.
That's great, because you never know like who will influence you until later. Like like something as simple as someone having glasses.
And then one of the greatest communicators, Fulton Sheen, was, and I'm not particularly that religious, but Fulton Sheen was on Dumas, and he was one of the greatest communicators of all time. He'd look in the camera, and his eyes would penetrate your soul. This was great communicating, and I was a big introvert growing up.
Okay.
Big introvert, and I would watch Fulton Sheen communicate with people, and I go, wow, that's fantastic. And you got to remember, I was like maybe 10 years old. Kids aren't too much watching religion, but he was such a fascinating communicator that I, by watching him, learned a lot about how to communicate with people. So he was another one of my people who inspired me in the business.
That's really, because you weren't thinking, obviously you weren't thinking about, gee, I'll have a TV show in 20 years. And
No.
But you said you were an introvert, so this is something that you took away from this.
And then Gene Shepard, who had a show on the radio, he was sort of like the poor man's Mark Twain, and he would get on the radio for close to 2 hours without a script and talk about life. And he did that 5 nights a week on the radio. And he was also a tremendous communicator as far as talking about America, what American life was like, in such a wonderful way. And he did it without a script, 5 nights a week for over 2 hours a night. Wow. And he did that for 5 or 6 years, and you're going, how could anybody do that?
And he doesn't have people calling in. This is like strictly...
No, just strictly a talk show.
Wow.
He was another inspiration. You know, too many great people today, in my opinion. You know, I turn on the TV today and they have these groups. I don't know who they are. I don't go past Glenn Miller as far as music. And they have all these people talking and singing and yelling. And I'm going, what is this about? You know, what's going on? You know, showing my age, right?
But still, you know, it's different. I mean, it's different.
Yeah.
But, I mean, if you're used to a certain type of music, I can understand that.
Remember when the Beatles came out, my parents said, they're terrible. And we loved the Beatles, right? When I first heard the name Beatles, a friend said, have you heard the Beatles? And I went, is that a bug on the floor? What is that? No, it's a singing group. And they were like George Gershwin as far as popular music, with all of the wonderful music. And
I mean, their music is still great today.
Still
you know
today.
what I mean? It's
which is a test of time music.
Exactly.
Irving Caesar, who we talked about before, said on the show, this is 1975, he said, show me what America is singing and I'll show you what America is thinking. And that still stays into my mind today.
That leaves a lot to be considered, considering what I see.
What you see today compared to, you know, years ago it was how much is that doggy in the window? Now it's things we don't want to talk about. You know, there's a whole change in music.
Yes.
Really is.
We're just about out of time. That went really, really fast.
It went too fast.
I so appreciate you coming on and telling.
Great to be on your show.
It's been a while.
I admired you for a long time. I love your show. You're the best.
No, I like I said, I really like your show, so I'm glad you were able to come on. And for people who just joined in, you're Mike Sobel. The name of your show is Nostalgia Alley. They can also find it on Soma Television and also on YouTube, Soma Television, YouTube. And thank you again for being here. And you know what? I'd love for you to come back another time. And
absolutely.
We can do this again.
Okay, sounds great.
Thank you so much for watching. I'm Dustin. This was Dustin's Kaleidoscope, and we will see you next time. Bye.